He stood at the shelter entrance, pen poised, adoption application partially completed, prepared to depart from a German shepherd that remained silent, merely staring. No wagging tail, no whimper, until the man turned to leave. Then, a sound emerged, low, fractured, like sorrow itself. A cry that did not solicit a second opportunity. It asserted one. That solitary instant would unravel all the man believed he understood about bereavement, allegiance, and the type of affection that waits patiently behind enclosure bars. What transpired next, no one anticipated. The shelter exuded an aroma of disinfectant and desolation. Rows of barking, tail-wagging canines vied for notice, yet one enclosure remained unervingly silent. Within it lay a male German shepherd, larger than most, with a scar across his snout, his ears twitching at every sound, but his eyes fixed in a perpetual gaze at the cold wall. His identification tag, smudged and nearly illegible, read, "Rusty." He remained motionless when someone passed. He did not flinch at the cacophony of barks. He simply waited, immobile as he had for months. And on this day, another name was inscribed on the visitor roster: Thomas Blake. Thomas entered the facility like a man stepping into a judicial proceeding. His entire demeanor conveyed, "I do not belong here." He disregarded the wagging tails and hopeful gazes. He was not seeking joy. He was undertaking this action because someone had implored him to do so. His sister, after months of observing him withdraw further into himself following the passing of his wife. A dog, she had suggested, might be the only thing capable of reaching him. He had detested the notion until he encountered Rusty. Their eyes met, and something within Thomas shifted, something he could not articulate. Rusty did not bark, did not move, did not whimper. He merely stared with a stillness that conveyed, "I, too, have witnessed too much." Thomas continued walking, glancing at the dog every few seconds as if attempting to resist being drawn in. But it was too late, he already was. Linda, the shelter manager, approached him with tentative optimism. She possessed that tone, the one people employ when they have recounted the same sorrowful tale too many times. Rusty was a K9, she explained, who had lost his handler during active service. Since then, he had been quiet, returning with both internal and external scars. Thomas gazed at the dog once more. His hands trembled as he reached for the adoption paperwork. Half of it had already been completed by Linda, sensing this might finally be the one. Thomas sat down. The pen hovered, name, address, phone number. But the instant he reached the signature line, something within his chest seized. "I'm sorry," he said, backing away from the table. "I thought I could do this." Linda blinked. "He's been waiting a long time." Thomas turned back one last time. Rusty hadn't moved, still lying in that same frozen pose. No expression, no sound. And then it happened. A sound so low, so fragile, it silenced the entire shelter. A broken howl, short, painful, like something tearing loose from within. Thomas froze mid-step. He turned. Rusty was still lying down, but now his eyes were glistening. A single tear slid down his muzzle. No one in the shelter moved, not even the other dogs. Linda whispered, "He's never done that for anyone." Thomas stood there, paralyzed, his heart pounding in his ears. Rusty didn't beg. He didn't crawl to the gate. He just stayed there, broken and proud, as if saying, "If you leave, I won't chase you, but I'll remember." And that silent moment, that small, gut-wrenching act, it shattered something inside Thomas that hadn't broken when his wife died. Something deeper. He turned, walked out the door, sat in his truck, and stared at the wheel. And that sound, that one heartbroken cry, it wouldn't leave his head. He closed his eyes, fists tight. The dog wasn't just waiting for a home. He was waiting for someone who'd stay. And Thomas, for the first time in a long time, wasn't sure if he could live with walking away. Thomas remained in his truck like a man caught between two existences. His hand gripped the steering wheel tightly, Yet his thoughts lingered in the shelter, fixed on the eyes of a dog who did not solicit compassion but silently lamented the forfeiture of yet another potential. Outside, snow had commenced its descent, soft and unceasing, dusting the windshield like the passage of time attempting to obscure the acuteness of what he had just witnessed. Within the cab, Thomas struggled to breathe truly. He was not a man easily affected. He had interred his wife without a single public display of tears. He had managed loss with a methodical, emotionless precision. But that sound, that fractured, gasping utterance from the dog, had struck a chord no therapist, no sermon, no alcoholic beverage had ever reached. He attempted to start the engine. It refused to turn over, not an issue with the battery but with his own volition. His reflection in the rearview mirror resembled a phantom inhabiting his form. Rusty's visage filled his mind once more. That cry was not loud, nor was it prolonged, but it was the type of sound that clings to one's very core, not desperate, but defeated, the kind of sound uttered only by a being with nothing left. And then, like a cruel echo, an image of his wife, Emily, smiling in their old kitchen, kneeling to feed the stray dog that used to frequent their yard, resurfaced. One day, she had remarked with that characteristic blend of teasing and seriousness, "A dog will choose you." It had once elicited laughter from him, now it felt like a prophecy inscribed in sorrow. Inside the shelter, Linda stood immobilized in the corridor. Volunteers who had served there for years witnessed injured strays, emaciated puppies, and elderly dogs brought in with trembling paws had never encountered anything like this. Rusty lay motionless, his eyes glazed. Yet it was not mere sadness, it was a profound depth of loss that could only originate from a being who remembered the sensation of love and understood the cost of hoping for it anew. Thomas exited the truck like a man burdened by invisible fetters. Each footstep back towards the shelter entrance felt more ponderous. He paused at the doorway, took a breath. The bell above the door emitted a soft chime. Linda looked up, her eyes wide. He uttered no words, simply walked back in and stood before the kennel. Rusty lifted his head slowly. His tail did not wag, his ears did not perk, but his eyes illuminated with something akin to belief. "I can't leave him like that," Thomas whispered, as if attempting to rationalize it more to himself than to anyone else. Linda's voice cracked. "He still hasn't moved." Thomas picked up the clipboard. His hand did not tremble this time. He signed the line he had walked away from 20 minutes prior. It was not merely a signature, it was a solemn promise. He approached the kennel slowly and knelt. Rusty stood, unsteady yet alert. One step forward, then another. No dramatic leap, no bark, no cry. He simply reached Thomas and gently pressed his forehead into the man's chest, like a soldier finally permitted to rest. Thomas remained still, merely closing his eyes and placing a hand on Rusty's back. Neither of them spoke, words were unnecessary. Two wounded souls, both betrayed by life, both searching for something lost, had just forged a silent pact. They were not mending each other, they were now surviving in unison. And at times, that is more potent than healing. No commands, no leash, just a quiet walk through the shelter's rear exit and into a storm that suddenly felt less frigid. The adoption was concluded with a quietude that bore more significance than any festivity. No expressions of joy, no congratulatory gestures, merely a subtle nod from Linda and a glance from Rusty that conveyed everything words could not. Thomas led him out through the shelter doors as snowflakes eddied in the wind, touching the dog's fur for what might have been the initial instance in months. No leash, no directives, just unhurried footsteps side by side, like two phantoms endeavoring to recall how to exist once more. The truck door creaked open and Rusty remained motionless. Thomas gestured, waiting. The dog showed no reluctance, simply entering with a slow grace that suggested he had performed this action countless times before. Yet, the manner in which he lay down, rigid, tail tucked, provided all the evidence Thomas required. This was not comfort, it was acquiescence. Rusty was not home, he was anticipating being returned yet again. The journey out of town was lengthy, navigating through pine-lined back roads that eventually transitioned to the open expanse leading to Thomas's residence, an old craftsman-style dwelling situated just outside Livingston, Montana. The house stood on a broad parcel of land bordered by tall trees and weathered fencing. It was not opulent, but it offered space and tranquility, and for the first time in years, it was welcoming something that resembled life. When Thomas opened the truck door, Rusty alighted but did not explore. He stood like a soldier at attention, his eyes surveying the tree line, the porch, the sound of distant birds. Thomas observed how every movement the dog made was calculated, purposeful, even his stillness felt rehearsed. Inside the house, Rusty followed, not with inquisitiveness, but with a sense of duty. His paws made no sound on the wooden floors, he moved like a shadow. Thomas tossed a blanket onto the living room floor and poured water into a bowl. The food remained untouched. The dog lay down near the fireplace, head low, ears alert, not relaxed, merely waiting. That night, Thomas tossed in bed, the creaks of the house seeming louder, the emptiness even more pronounced. Around midnight, he heard movement, soft, almost a whisper. He walked into the hallway and found Rusty pacing near the laundry room. Then, suddenly, the dog stopped. There, beneath the bench, were a pair of worn-out boots, Emily's boots. Rusty lay beside them and remained still. He did not sniff, paw, or whimper, he just stared. Thomas sank to the floor beside him, his legs folding slowly like a man succumbing to an unavoidable force. He remained silent for a long time, the air between them thick with unspoken history. Then finally, softly, Thomas said, "You lost someone, too, huh?" Rusty shifted, not a reaction, not a trick, just the slow, deliberate lowering of his head into Thomas's lap. It wasn't trained, it was a choice. For a moment, everything in the house grew still, as if grief itself had exhaled. Thomas closed his eyes, his hand resting on Rusty's fur. And for the first time in over a year, sleep didn't feel like escape, it felt like rest. By morning, Thomas found Rusty standing at the front door, tail lowered but ears erect, his posture solid, like a guardian. No training command had been spoken, no leash clipped, just instinct. This was now his post, his home, his man. Thomas opened the door, watching as the dog stepped out onto the porch and surveyed the land. Something had shifted. Rusty hadn't just come home, he had taken responsibility for it. By the third morning, the dog had committed to memory the sound of Thomas's boots on the hardwood floor. He recognized which floorboard creaked when Thomas approached the kitchen and knew precisely how long the kettle took to whistle. A routine had established itself, yet peace remained elusive. The dog, vigilant and quiet, moved through the house like a seasoned soldier on patrol, not a domestic pet. He did not solicit affection, though he accepted it. He did not engage in play, though he remained alert. What Thomas began to observe, however, was the dog's apparent anticipation of his actions, opening low drawers with his nose when Thomas fumbled for tools, gently nudging him away from a boiling stovetop, even barking once, sharp and controlled, when a neighborhood cat ventured too close to the porch. This was not random behavior, it was training. A quiet curiosity blossomed in Thomas's chest. This was not merely an intelligent dog, this was a dog who had experienced something, done something, and whatever it was, it had left an indelible mark upon him. Linda, the shelter manager, had casually mentioned on adoption day that the dog had been returned twice, once by an elderly couple. Thomas decided to pursue this lead. He called the number on the adoption paperwork, which connected him to a man named Richard Rowan residing just south of Billings. The voice on the other end trembled when Thomas uttered the dog's name. "You have him?" Richard inquired. "Rusty?" "Yes, sir." A lengthy pause ensued, this one heavier. Richard's voice cracked. "My boy, he didn't come home." "Rusty did." Thomas's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." "He wouldn't eat, wouldn't bark. Slept by the door, waiting for Dale. We tried. God, we tried, but we're too old." He stopped responding, just faded into himself. "We thought he was ready to die." Thomas asked if Rusty had served officially. "More than officially," Richard said. "Classified stuff. Deep field deployments. I don't know everything, but I know this. He was more than a tracker, he was a partner. My son trusted him with his life." The call concluded, but its weight lingered. That evening, Thomas loaded the dog into the truck and drove to a small cemetery near Billings. The sun was setting as they arrived, the cold air wrapping around them like a second skin. The headstone was simple, Sergeant Dale Rowan, faithful until the end. Thomas issued no command, the dog stepped forward autonomously. He lowered his head, then slowly, as if gravity itself had intensified, lay down in the snow beside the grave. Minutes passed, then an hour. Thomas remained silent, observing. It wasn't grief that permeated the air, it was reverence, memory, a vow that had not perished with the man to whom it was made. Eventually, Thomas knelt beside Rusty and whispered, "You never stopped waiting, did you?" His voice cracked. "Neither did I." There, on that frozen patch of earth, Thomas spoke aloud to someone he hadn't addressed in months. "I'm sorry, Em," he said, his eyes wet. "I don't know why I made it through that wreck and you didn't." He paused, choking on the guilt he'd buried under work, silence, and time. Rusty shifted quietly, then placed his paw gently over Thomas's hand, not a trick, not a command, just presence. And it was enough. Later that night, back home, Thomas stood in the yard, watching the horizon fade to black. Rusty stood beside him, eyes sharp, posture alert. That's when he saw it. A black sedan parked far down the road, lights off, engine idling, watching, waiting. And suddenly, Thomas realized the story wasn't finished, not even close. Initially, Thomas dismissed it as mere paranoia. A black sedan idling excessively on the road could signify various things: a disoriented driver, an inquisitive neighbor, someone consulting their GPS. However, Rusty's reaction indicated otherwise. The moment the car materialized, the dog became rigid as stone, no bark, no growl, just a stillness more profound than any sound. His ears pointed forward like antennae, his body leaned towards the window, his eyes fixed. Thomas had witnessed that expression before in old photographs of military patrols on the faces of soldiers just before an explosion. The car had departed by the time Thomas ventured outside. But that evening, as he went to secure the front gate, he noticed something amiss. The latch was loose, unfastened, and he knew he hadn't forgotten to secure it. Rusty stood beside him like a shadow, unblinking. Thomas required no words to comprehend. Someone had been there. The following morning, Rusty did not eat, not from sadness, but from a state of heightened vigilance. He followed Thomas from room to room, his steps invariably light and precise. And when Thomas drove into town, Rusty insisted on occupying the passenger seat, scrutinizing every passing vehicle as if scanning for a threat only he could perceive. Thomas began making inquiries, starting with Linda. She had no new information except for one detail: that's not the first time someone's asked about Rusty after he left. Thomas's gut twisted. He contacted a former Army associate who had previously done contract work with K9 handlers and now resided near Billings. They hadn't spoken in years, but once Thomas described Rusty, his scars, behavior, and breed, the silence on the other end became sharp. That dog didn't just serve, his friend stated. If he's who I think he is, he was part of an off-the-record joint task. Dogs like him weren't just sniffing out bombs, they were eyes, ears, witnesses. And sometimes witnesses are liabilities. Liabilities. The word lodged in Thomas's throat like acid. He looked over at Rusty, asleep but alert even in dreams, his tail twitching like a taut wire. He wasn't just guarding the house. He was anticipating something or someone. Later that day, Thomas found a package near his mailbox with no return address. It wasn't ticking, nor was it large, but it was peculiar enough to arouse his caution. Inside was a collar, a replica of Rusty's original military gear, but newer, shinier, excessively clean. The note taped beneath bore 3 words, inscribed in sharp black ink: "Return the dog." Thomas didn't blink. He didn't panic. He burned the note. That night, Thomas began to formulate new plans. He retrieved a dusty atlas from a drawer and circled a distant location: his late uncle's cabin near Flathead Lake. Remote, difficult to access, perhaps safe. He packed bags in silence, including food, winter gear, and tools. Rusty observed but never interfered. When Thomas finally zipped the last bag and looked into those eyes, he saw a flicker of recognition, of readiness. As they pulled out of the driveway under a sky choked with winter stars, Rusty sat rigid in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. Thomas didn't have to look. He knew someone was behind them, but for now, distance equated to survival. And if they were fleeing, at least they were fleeing together. Next stop, the edge of the map, where pasts unravel and secrets surface, where silence speaks louder than words, and sometimes louder than gunfire. By the time Thomas arrived at the cabin, the Montana air had thinned and turned frigid, stinging his skin like minute needles. The trees swayed like ancient sentinels, whispering amongst themselves, and the lake shimmered behind them, partially frozen. It was a location so tranquil, even the wind seemed to move with diffidence. He hadn't visited in years, not since his uncle's passing, but everything remained as it was. The firewood still neatly arranged, the generator still sputtering to life when started. For a fleeting moment, it almost felt like security, almost. Rusty did not immediately exit the truck. He first surveyed the surroundings, scanned every tree, and listened intently. Only when he was content did he step down, his paws pressing lightly on the frost-covered ground. His nose twitched, his ears perked. He was not relaxing, he was patrolling. Thomas spent the afternoon unloading provisions, stacking canned goods, tools, dog food, and blankets. Rusty shadowed his every move, silent as an apparition. But just as Thomas was about to close the tailgate, he noticed Rusty digging near the edge of the cabin's fence. It was an urgent, frantic excavation, not the leisurely digging of a bored canine. This was precise, focused, and desperate. Thomas called out, but Rusty did not cease. Within minutes, he unearthed a small black box, square, metallic, and blinking, a tracking device. Thomas's heart pounded. He reached for it with trembling hands. The device was military grade. He recognized the model, and it was still operational. The realization struck him like ice-penetrating bone. Someone had been tracking Rusty, not recently, but all along. He smashed it against a rock and hurled the fragments into the lake. That night, sleep eluded him. Thomas sat in the darkness, shotgun across his knees, while Rusty lay by the door, his ears twitching at every creak and whisper from outside. Just before dawn, a sound shattered the silence. A heavy rustle near the shed, followed by footsteps. Deliberate, close, not an animal. Thomas moved towards the back window, his heart thundering. He saw a figure in dark clothing crouched by the door, attempting to force the lock. Before Thomas could react, Rusty was already moving, silently and swiftly. He launched through the side entrance and slammed into the intruder with ferocity. A struggle ensued, a yell, then scrambling footsteps fleeing into the woods. Rusty did not pursue. He returned, panting, tail low, eyes alert. Thomas contacted the sheriff, but the response was dilatory. Small town, limited resources, too many false alarms. No arrests, no follow-up, just a shrug and an admonition to keep his doors locked. But Thomas was not planning to await a second encounter. He loaded the truck again, this time for an extended journey. There was one remaining option, somewhere more distant, safer. He turned to Rusty and said, "We need to disappear for a while." The dog's response, a quiet nudge against Thomas's arm, seemed to convey, "Lead the way." Hours later, they reached the far side of Flathead Lake. Snow coated the trees in silence. The old forest ranger's outpost stood like a forgotten secret among the pines. No roads, no lights, just stillness. Here they unpacked once more. That night, inside the wood-framed shelter with a fire crackling low, Thomas watched Rusty sleep, truly sleep. No pacing, no growling, just a soft breath rising and falling. The dog had risked his life to protect him again. And Thomas, he was no longer the man who had walked out of the shelter. Something had cracked open. Trust, loyalty, perhaps even love. He whispered into the flickering dark, "I don't know what they want from you, boy, but whatever it is, they'll have to go through me now." Outside, under the snow-heavy branches, 3 sets of boots crunched silently into the clearing. And just like that, the calm ended. The wind clawed at the windows as if desperate for entry. Thomas had just drifted off in the armchair when Rusty's low growl sliced through the silence like a razor. A single glance at the dog, and he knew this was no false alarm. Rusty stood motionless as stone, nose pointed towards the door, ears erect. The posture that signals danger is not approaching, but already present. Thomas reached for the rifle he had propped against the wall. The fire had dwindled to glowing embers, casting flickering red hues across the room. And then a soft click, not from within but from the porch. Someone had stepped onto it. Slow, deliberate steps that made no attempt at concealment. Then another and another. A trio of shadows passed by the frosted window, elongated and moving with trained precision. Not looters, not hikers. These were professionals. Before panic could take hold, Thomas signaled to Rusty and moved swiftly. He pulled the floor rug aside and yanked open the trapdoor leading to the crawl space beneath the cabin. It was cramped and dusty, but just spacious enough. They slid down into the darkness, and Thomas closed the hatch above them just as the front door creaked open. Footsteps entered, followed by calm, cold voices, muffled, yet distinct enough. "He's here. Tracker died yesterday. Dog probably found it." A second voice, "Find the asset. Erase the history." Thomas's pulse hammered in his ears. Rusty didn't growl this time, he didn't move. He just stared up at Thomas, eyes sharp, chest rising slowly. The message was clear. Stay silent. Above them, heavy boots scraped across the floor, one step at a time, pausing, listening, breathing. The cabin groaned under the weight of decisions made years ago, decisions neither Thomas nor Rusty had ever solicited. Then a voice uttered something that nearly stole Thomas's breath. Dog saw the face. He remembers. If Command finds out he's still alive. Rusty stiffened. In that moment, everything became clear. The surveillance, the tracker, the break-ins. Rusty had been part of something too sensitive to be allowed to remain at large. Someone in a position of authority wanted to permanently bury what he knew. He wasn't just a dog with a past. He was a living witness. Suddenly, a sharp noise. Something knocked over above them. The crawlspace latch shifted slightly. They had found it. Thomas whispered one word. Run. He shoved the door open and Rusty lunged through. A flash of motion, the sound of a body hitting the floor, and then chaos. Thomas grabbed his bag and bolted after Rusty, through the cabin and into the night. The snow struck his face like needles. Behind him, shouts, footsteps, gunshots. One bullet snapped past his shoulder and lodged in a tree. Rusty took the lead, weaving through the trees as if he knew the forest by heart. Thomas followed blindly, heart pounding, slipping on ice, stumbling over roots. His shoulder slammed into a trunk hard, but he didn't stop. Not now, not with those men behind him. They ran for what felt like hours until they reached the edge of a frozen creek near an old ranger outpost. Abandoned, broken but with just enough shelter to disappear into. Thomas collapsed behind the wall, chest heaving. Rusty lay next to him, tongue lolling but eyes scanning the woods like sentinels that never sleep. Thomas looked at him and whispered through the cold, I almost left you at that shelter. He couldn't finish the sentence. Rusty placed a paw on his leg, leaned against him, and closed his eyes. That single gesture struck harder than any bullet. This dog hadn't just saved him tonight, he'd pulled him back from a life lived half alive. He was more than a second chance, he was the reason Thomas had won it all. And somewhere in that dark forest, the hunt wasn't over. But for now, in this fragile silence, man and dog sat side by side, exhausted, wounded, and fiercely, impossibly alive. The ranger outpost consisted of little more than a few planks held together by rusted nails and the tenacious resilience of old Montana timber. Snow infiltrated every crevice. The cold was severe, yet it was not what caused Thomas to shiver, it was the gravity of all he had just comprehended, the shadow of Rusty's past, the gunman's words, the realization that his decision to depart from the shelter could have cost more than merely a second opportunity, it could have cost them both their lives. The dog lay beside him, his breathing now steady, a quiet sentinel in the snow. For the first time since their meeting, Thomas felt not just gratitude for Rusty, but awe. This was not merely a dog who had been injured, he was a dog who had been pursued, exploited, and yet, somehow, still chose to love again. Thomas activated the emergency beacon integrated into the ranger's radio. Without hesitation, the red light blinked, transmitting a signal into the void, hoping for a response. And a response came. It took hours, long, tense, frozen hours. But then headlights pierced the trees. The initial responders were from the sheriff's department, but they were not alone. Among them was a man in civilian attire, yet with a posture too rigid, too sharp, military. One could sense it from a distance. He exited his vehicle and locked eyes with Rusty. The recognition was instantaneous. You've got something special there, he remarked to Thomas. Thomas, bruised and bleeding but unbowed, replied, I know. The officer did not provide a name, it was unnecessary. He glanced at the old tracking device in Thomas's hand, nodded once, and simply stated, there won't be any more trouble. Then, without another word, he walked away, cleanly, quietly, like someone who had just erased a file no one was meant to know existed. Days later, Thomas and Rusty were home. The cabin was gone, but their bond remained, more resilient than any winter. The sheriff personally delivered an official document, finalized adoption, no questions asked. He's yours now for good. Rusty began to change day by day. He started eating like a dog who desired to live. He barked at the mailman with purpose. He napped in the sun. But most importantly, he watched over Thomas with a loyalty that couldn't be trained, only earned. One morning, while walking down Main Street, Thomas and Rusty passed a veterans memorial. An older man sitting on a bench looked up and froze. He stood slowly, approached Rusty, and without a word, saluted. Rusty stared back for a long moment. Then he did something he hadn't done for anyone else in months. He raised a paw as if remembering the command and placed it gently in the man's hand. The man whispered something Thomas couldn't hear. Then he simply walked away, wiping his eyes. Thomas didn't chase after him, he didn't need to. Back home, Rusty lay on the porch, eyes closed, sun warming his fur. Thomas sat beside him with a coffee mug and a deep breath. There were no more trackers, no more shadows, no more ghosts, just the wind in the trees and the hum of quiet peace. He looked down at the dog, the one he almost walked away from, and whispered, "You didn't just survive, did you? You saved me." Rusty opened one eye, then let out a low, content huff. In that moment, it became crystal clear, this wasn't just a story about rescue, it was about redemption. Two souls that were broken in all the right ways to fit back together. And from the silence that started it all, they had built a life that spoke louder than any words ever could.